Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or the guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's September 11th, and we have a lot to talk about. My guest on the podcast today is Mitch Sturgeon. Mitch is an award-winning blogger, and now with the publication of his book, Enjoying the Ride, 2 Generations of Tragedy and Triumph, Mitch is a published author as well. In 2001, Mitch was diagnosed with primary progressive MS, but his book is about much more than his MS journey. It's a story about a family that learns to literally roll with some pretty big punches that life throws at it. I found the book to be both inspiring and instructive. But before we get to my conversation with Mitch Sturgeon, there are a few other things that you should know about. A lot of you already know my story. If you don't, the very short version is that my wife Jean was diagnosed with secondary progressive MS in 1997. Her case was particularly aggressive, and in 2009 she required more care than I could possibly provide at home. And her doctors made a very strong case that she needed to be in a skilled nursing facility. And as Jean transitioned to a nursing home, I transitioned from being her full-time caregiver to being her advocate. By 2013, Jean had become nonverbal, and my role as her medical advocate became even more important. I was the one who would literally speak on her behalf. By 2016, Jean required more care than she could even find in a skilled nursing facility, and she was transferred to a subacute nursing facility. Now, subacute nursing homes are pretty rare. They're a step above a skilled nursing facility and a half step below a regular hospital. But as I talk to people, they sometimes wonder what it means when I say that I'm Jean's advocate. So I wanted to share a recent experience that I think does a great job of illustrating my role. It also illustrates a few realities about nursing homes in America. I visit Jean just about every day, and on this particular day, I walked into her room and I saw that the LED display on an electric pump at the foot of her bed was registering low, and the pump was emitting a beeping alarm. And even though there was a nurse standing in her room, it felt like I was the only one who heard this extremely annoying alarm. So I asked her nurse about it, and her nurse told me that the pump had been beeping and registering low since her shift began, which was about 3 hours earlier. But to quote her nurse now, the good news is that everything is okay. Well, color me a little crazy, but when I hear an alarm constantly beeping, I'm going to assume it's for some reason, so maybe something isn't okay. So I shared my concern with her nurse, and she told me that she really didn't know too much about these pumps, but she would get someone who did. So she returned a few minutes later with a guy who looked at the pump, heard the beeping, and told her that he didn't know anything about it either, but he did know the one employee at the nursing home who is an expert in these pumps, and he would find him. About 5 minutes later, the expert walked in. He looked at the pump, saw that it was reading low, and he heard the beeping. Now, I should also mention here that my wife Jean was in absolutely no discomfort during all of this, which is the only reason it's an entertaining story instead of a sad story. So the expert looked at the nurse, grabbed the plastic tubing that ran from the pump and continued under the sheets in Jean's bed, and gave it a slight pull. Well, the tubing was easy to pull out from under Jean's sheets because it wasn't connected to anything. He lifted the sheet to show us the other piece of identical tubing that ran from the pump ran to an inflatable cuff around Jean's left leg. It's there to promote circulation in patients who are bedbound. Now, the reason for the alarm became pretty obvious. There was no inflatable cuff around Jean's other leg. None at all. The expert looked at the nurse and told her that the alarm was going off because the tubing wasn't connected to anything. The pump was registering low because there was no air pressure to measure, because there was no inflatable cuff. Well, after the expert left, I looked at the nurse and asked her that, considering the tubing was going nowhere except under a sheet and doing Jean no good at all, what exactly did she mean when she told me that the good news was that everything is okay? Well, she told me when she had checked Jean, the leg with the inflatable cuff had been resting on top of her other leg, and so that lower leg, the one without the cuff, couldn't really be seen. And now that Jean had shifted her legs and changed her position, well, the problem became obvious. And that would have made a lot of sense, I told her, if Jean had been capable of moving her legs. But since that hadn't happened in more than a decade, I was wondering if her nurse wanted to take another try at explaining the situation, which was only getting worse and worse for the nurse. So apologies were made, a new inflatable cuff was placed on the leg that needed it, the plastic tubing was connected, and the pump magically stopped beeping. A couple of minutes later, after the cuff had inflated, the LED display on the pump no longer read low, and now finally, to paraphrase Jean's nurse, everything really was great. So what does it mean to be someone's advocate? Well, it means holding healthcare professionals accountable. In the most comical no-stress situations like this one, and in the most critical high-stress situations that I'll spare you from listening to. After 9 years in 5 nursing homes, I've found that there are 2 types of people you'll find working in a nursing home. On the one hand, you'll find nurses, nurses' aides, respiratory specialists, and others who are committed to their work. These are the professionals who go the extra mile on behalf of their patients. These are the nursing home staff who see the patient that they're caring for, and they react to what they see. And then there's the other type of nursing home staff. These are the people who are working there because they've determined that this is the job that will pay them the most, and so it's the job that they take. And these people have the unique ability to be able to go through all the motions of doing their jobs without ever actually seeing the patient. I absolutely believe that if someone's hair was on fire, this type of nursing home professional would never see the flames. And unfortunately, this type of nursing home professional can frequently make up the majority. Now, the advantage that I have as Jean's advocate is that I only have one patient to think about, and I know everything about this one patient. I know her baseline blood pressure. I know that her body temperature runs slightly cooler. I know that her typical heart rate is, well, exactly where it should be. And when any of these things are different, when there's a change, I know I need to ask somebody about it and not accept a pat answer like, everything's great. And this is even a truer statement if you happen to be advocating on behalf of someone with multiple sclerosis. Because then I know that I have to teach the nursing staff that piling on blankets at night is going to overheat Jean. And that means something different and leads to different consequences when someone has MS and they get overheated. I know that in Jean's case, I need to request a fan at her bedside to augment the air conditioning in the nursing home because that's going to keep her as healthy as possible when the outside temperatures climb to 90, 95 degrees, and that happens too often during the summer in Southern California. Being Jean's advocate means reviewing Jean's medications with her nurses to be sure she's getting everything that she needs. It means advising the nursing home staff that I need to be contacted should there be any sort of change on any of these medications. Frequently, a well-meaning doctor won't be familiar with why Jean is receiving a particular medication, and they'll write an order to discontinue it. Well, sometimes that has, it certainly can lead to negative and easily avoidable consequences. And I found this to be as true in a hospital as it is in a nursing home. When Jean moved from our home into skilled nursing and I no longer had to function as her full-time caregiver, I wondered a bit about what my role as her advocate was really all about. I've come to understand that my role allows me to achieve the two treatment objectives that I still have complete control over: to make sure that Jean is receiving the best possible care, and to make sure that she's made 100% comfortable. And I wake up every day focused on doing what it takes to make sure that those two objectives are going to be met, one day at a time. Cognitive decline in MS is something that we talk about on the podcast because I know many of you have experienced it to varying degrees. And whether you've experienced cognitive decline or not, it's something you tend to think about when you're living with MS. Because our ability to think about things, to function cognitively, well, it often expresses who we are and how we are. And there's always that small fear that who we are and how we are can be changed. But you may not be as familiar with a concept called cognitive reserve. Cognitive reserve refers to a person's capacity to maintain normal cognitive function in the presence of some sort of brain pathology, like multiple sclerosis. In other words, cognitive reserve can lead to cognitive resilience, and everyone's level of cognitive reserve isn't the same. The amount of cognitive reserve that an individual has is determined by a number of different factors that relate to that person's life experience. Things like their level of education, their level of social interaction out in the world, and whether they have a complex or cognitively demanding job like a managerial or professional career. And a small study team at Penn State University makes the case that cognitive reserve can moderate the relationship between disability and depression in MS. Their study looked at 54 people living with MS. They were screened for their level of depression and their level of disability. Their cognitive reserve was measured in two different ways. It was measured using their years of education and their intelligence, measured through a standardized intelligence test, and it was also measured using their answers to a standard cognitive health questionnaire that many of you listening may have been asked to take. Well, analyzing their results, the research team found that a person's level of MS disability only influenced depression among people with low cognitive reserve. People with higher cognitive reserve didn't have this correlation between their level of disability and their level of depression. And we've talked a lot about the relationship, the high correlation between MS and depression. This small study may serve as a step toward enlightening us as to who carries a higher risk for developing depression among people living with MS. I'll include a link to the study in today's show notes. In the United States, this week marks the return of the NFL, and for almost everyone, NFL stands for the National Football League. But when neuroscientists talk about the NFL, it's usually not about sports. It's about neurofilament light chain. Neurofilament light chain is a protein, and evidence shows that the levels of neurofilament light chain are increased in the blood and cerebrospinal fluid of patients with MS. Neurofilament light chain is usually found only in nerve cells, but as MS causes the progressive degeneration of our nerve cells, this neurofilament light chain is released into the blood and cerebrospinal fluid. So the idea that neurofilament light chain can serve as a biomarker for MS progression is an idea that's gaining interest and momentum. And just to step back and review for a minute, a biomarker is a measurable characteristic in our bodies whose presence indicate that something is taking place. That something might be disease or infection. For instance, When your doctor gives you a simple blood test and finds that your white cell count is elevated, that is a biomarker of infection. So biomarkers that detect MS early and can help neurologists accurately predict disease progression is a major area of interest in MS research. Well, two researchers at the first affiliated hospital of Nanchang University in the People's Republic of China combed through over 900 studies contained in 3 major databases, and from this pool identified the results of 15 studies. 10 of these studies measured the levels of neurofilament light chain in cerebrospinal fluid, and 5 of the studies measured the levels of neurofilament light chain in blood. The 15 studies included 1,665 MS patients and 986 healthy control subjects. And the analysis of the aggregate findings of all of these studies indicated that the level of neurofilament light chain, either in the cerebrospinal fluid or blood, was significantly higher in MS patients than it was in the healthy control group. Well, these results lend one more piece of scientific evidence that the presence of neurofilament light chain in either cerebrospinal fluid or blood can serve as a reliable biomarker to monitor disease progression, disease activity, and the effectiveness of treatment in MS patients. You'll find a link to the study in today's show notes. And in just a moment, we'll meet my guest, award-winning blogger and newly published author, Mitch Sturgeon. Mitch Sturgeon is an award-winning blogger, and now with the publication of his book, Enjoying the Ride, 2 Generations of Tragedy and Triumph, Mitch is a published author as well. In 2001, Mitch was diagnosed with primary progressive MS. He was 35 years old at the time, and that was the same age that Mitch's mother was when she took a fall that left her a quadriplegic. Mitch's book is more than just a reflection of his MS journey. It's a story about a family with all of the quirks, idiosyncrasies, strengths, and faults that any family might have, and how they lived through and even prospered in the face of tragic circumstances. Welcome to the podcast, Mitch.
Thank you, John. Glad to be here. And by the way, that description is better than any I've come up with. Do you mind if I use it?
Feel free. So let's start at the beginning. Why write a book?
Well, I had started this blog in 2009 when I stopped working, and I enjoyed writing essays about living a contented life as a disabled person and the things that I had learned about MS. And I started getting feedback from people that, geez, Mitch, you write so well, you ought to write a book. And I thought, well, I'm enjoying writing, but I don't know that I really have a story here. It's memoirs are supposed to be that everything was going fine, and then tragedy struck. I hit rock bottom and clawed my way out with help from so-and-so and so-and-so. But my life really hadn't followed that arc. It was more like I had a great life, something horrible happened, and things have gone about as well as can be expected. So I didn't think I really had a book there, but then I started thinking about the relationship between what I'm going through, and what my mother went through. And then that started to sound like it might be an interesting read for people to think about the coincidences between my mother and I, and everything that I learned growing up with her, and how closely my life is now resembling hers. So I decided that there might be a story there, and I dove in. It took me about 4 years to get comfortable with putting out a product that I thought I could be proud of.
Well, you mentioned your mother's story, and that was really the first thing I kind of wanted to dive into. In the first part of your book, you talk about your mother's story and how the accident that left her a quadriplegic changed things at home, but not as many things as some people might think. And that was really largely due to your mother managing her disability with just an amazing combination of strength and courage and grace. How do you think that influenced how you're managing life with MS today?
I think it had everything in the world to do with it. I've got some other advantages that we can touch on later, but just the basic, I don't know how much of it is inherited traits from my mother, and how much of it is what I learned from interacting with her and watching her. But it made all the difference in the world that I had this role model, as you described, that somebody that didn't accept their disability as something to hold them back, but just another another challenge to overcome. And she made it her. Everybody goes at these things a little bit differently. She made it her goal in life to be, I think, at least to be as useful as she could possibly be. So she became, she was a mother, a super mom. She took care of my father. She took care of me and my brothers, and that brought her great joy. And sometimes we wondered why, Mom, why don't you, put your energies towards something, for yourself? And that just isn't where she was. What she wanted to do was be as helpful and useful as she could, and that's what made her happy in life. Now, I'm not quite that way. I'm not quite that generous. I've got a lot of those traits, but just the idea that that she took the disability on. She didn't complain. She did, she made herself as much as she could. I couldn't have asked for a better role model. And of course, I didn't realize at the time just how appropriate these lessons would be. But boy, I sure realize it now.
I can imagine. Now, I mentioned when I introduced you that you were diagnosed in 2001, and in the book you write about how that process was, anything but straightforward. It took a few twists and turns, and I think that's something that, I know a lot of our listeners can relate to. Can you talk a little bit about your appearing, disappearing, and appearing again MS diagnosis?
Sure. So I started an exercise program one winter in my basement on a treadmill, and I just noticed that my left foot was going slap instead of quietly going from heel to toe like my right foot. I didn't think a lot of it, but when spring came in northern Maine and the snow eventually melted, so April, May, I took my exercise program outside and started jogging, and sure enough, that slapping problem was still there, and it caused some shin splints. So I said, I haven't been to the doctor in a couple of years, so I'll schedule a physical and mention this to the doctor. So when I did that, between the time I made the appointment and the time I went to the doctor, I learned that a friend of mine, an associate of mine, had come down with MS, and he had gait problems. So I thought, I've got to at least mention MS to my doctor. So when I went to the doctor and we talked about things, and I said, is it possible that it's MS? And he said, sure, it could be. So let's get you an MRI. So we got an MRI, and it came back with 1 or 2 lesions on my brain. And this doctor said, there's a good possibility you have MS. And but you've got to go to a neurologist to get a firm diagnosis. So, I really didn't, other than that one mention of my associate who had MS, I really didn't know what I was in for. So I said, so if it is MS, what do you think my prognosis is? And he said, he paused, and I had to drag it out of him. He says, you've probably got a good 20 years left. And I thought, oh my goodness, I've just been given a death sentence, albeit a delayed one by 20 years, but this is just horrible. So I grabbed my wife and we went and sat by the ocean. And just before we went there, she had printed out a bunch of information about MS. And pretty soon we realized that, that what the doctor said was absurd, and that, a lot of people get MS and live full lives and so on and so forth. So I went through a few hours of hell, and before I realized that things might be okay. And then I went to a neurologist, and the neurologist said, oh my goodness, I can't believe that doctor even mentioned MS. That's so unlikely. I'm sure it's something, less dire than that. And so I just went, we just watched things, and maybe a year went by, and things slowly got worse. That little slapping became a limp, and then both legs started getting tired. And eventually I found another neurologist, and he did an MRI of the cervical spine instead of just the brain. And boy, that's where with primary progressive MS, it's a common spot for your lesions to light right up in the cervical spine. And that's when I realized that I had MS, and that, I was diagnosed immediately with primary progressive MS. And then the thing about the doctor saying you have a good 20 years left, I think today that I probably misunderstood him. I think he probably said you have 20 good years left, which is, there are some studies that show that after about 20 years, people with MS develop secondary progressive. So I think in his own way, he was trying to tell me that things weren't going to be bad, at least for a long while. But I misunderstood him and put myself through quite a time. But I know that as you inferred, that so many people getting a diagnosis of MS is anything but a straightforward process. So, so I had this confusion, but I was diagnosed within a year and a half of speaking to a doctor about it the first time. And I know lots of people have gone a lot longer seeking that diagnosis or dreading that diagnosis.
Well, if we can fast forward a little bit, I read in your blog that you're being treated with Ocrevus, which is the only disease-modifying therapy that's been approved for treating progressive MS. How's that going so far?
Yeah, I wish I had better news to report on that. It seems my research kind of supports what I'm experiencing, is that people earlier in the disease with less disability are seeing more benefit from Ocrevus. I'm in a wheelchair. I've got no use of my legs, no use of my left hand. I've got enough use of my right hand to operate a mouse and a joystick. And I've had 2 treatments now. I'm going to get my 3rd in September, and I haven't noticed any stabilization of the disease. I'm still seeing disease progression. So I'm not holding out a lot of hope. I'm going to have 1, maybe 2 more treatments and talk about it with my doctor and decide whether to continue. But so I'm excited about Ocrevus for the portion of the primary progressive and secondary progressive population that it helps. But I'm still hoping for something better on the horizon.
Well, I think hopefully over the next 1 to 2 years, we're going to see some additional treatments for progressive MS make their way to final, approval, and hopefully we're going to get some success there.
It's good to see some emphasis being put on progressive MS research, so that's promising.
Absolutely. It's pretty clear in your book that stoicism was an important characteristic, especially among the men in your family. Do you think that was a good thing?
Well, it's good and bad. It's helped me ride out a lot of the emotional turmoil that maybe I would otherwise have experienced. And maybe, I've had this awakening as I was an engineer and a businessman, and I was pretty focused on my career before my diagnosis, and my stoicism kind of fed into that. But I've softened up since I stopped working. I've become an MS activist and a blogger and a writer. So I'm a lot more in touch with what's going on. So I think I found that balance of stoicism and I guess emotional intelligence that helps me ride through these bumps. And my brothers have told me too that they disagree with my assessment, that they think they've moved beyond the stoicism too. So it's I think it's a artifact of our upbringing by our father, who was very stoic, in northern Maine, where people tend to be very stoic, and it served us well at some point. But like I said, we've all moved a little bit beyond it now.
What's a takeaway that you'd like someone to have when they finish reading Enjoying the Ride?
I think there's a little bit there for everyone. And so I didn't write it in such a way that, I led the reader to certain conclusions. I wrote it in such a way that here's all the broad experiences I've had. Here's some things that worked for me. Take from it what you will, more or less. And some of those things are I ended up, as much as I didn't want to write a how-to book, I did at the end kind of summarize 10 or 12 items that I think helped me a lot. And those are things like, as we've already mentioned, not putting yourself on emotional roller coasters. One perspective that I like that helps me a lot is this idea that life doesn't owe me anything. So a lot of people would look and say, why me? Why is this happening to me? This isn't fair. But I've grown to accept that life doesn't owe me anything. I've got this concept of that we're all living on bonus time, if you will. So the likelihood of any one of us ever being born was so unlikely. Every one of our ancestors had to live to the age of reproduction without getting eaten by saber-toothed tigers or hit by asteroids and all that. So the very fact that you were born is a bit of a miracle. So anything after that is just bonus material. Yes, that's a little concept that I like to bring around. And then things like staying connected with other human beings, remaining inquisitive, just having gratitude for everything that is good in your life. I've got a lot of good things in my life, and frankly, I wouldn't trade my life for anyone else's, because everybody's got something, and it's not always visible. My something is highly visible, but so I have a lot of gratitude for everything that I have, and that that helps carry me through. So a little bit of everything, a lot of messages in there, and I just hope that everyone that reads it, finds some things that they can draw upon, whether they've got MS, some other chronic disease, or just for their daily struggles.
Well, sure. I think everybody is everybody has their own ride, if you will. And I think your book is absolutely on point in terms of dealing whatever that ride happens to be. But you mentioned it was a result of 4 years of effort to write the book, and then the whole process of actually getting it out. Now that that's starting to appear in the rearview mirror a little bit, what's next?
That, my friend, is a good question, and I've been asked it a lot. I haven't felt the itch to start a new book project yet. I'm having so much fun, frankly, rolling this book out right now. I've had a couple of very successful launch parties. I've done interviews for newspaper, television, podcasts like yours, and it's a lot of fun to finally get the product out there and start talking about it. I'm sure that I'm going to remain an MS advocate. I'm sure I'm going to maintain my blog, Enjoying the Ride, and we'll just see if I get the itch. Maybe when some of this dies down and the winter doldrums set in, maybe I'll have some time to see if I'm going to get creative and become an author, or I would find no disappointment, no shame in having this be a one-off. That I wrote a book as part of my advocacy business or endeavors, and that might be the case too. So I'm still going to be active in the MS world, the disability world. What form that will take, not quite sure yet.
Well, I'm sure you're going to find a way, whether it's, as you mentioned, continuing your advocacy efforts. The best thing I loved about what you just said was that right now you're having fun. And after putting in all of the incredible effort that it takes to put a book together, to write a book, the effort, the discipline, no easy feat for anyone. Afterwards, to be able to enjoy the process of getting it out there, being able to talk about it and have people react and respond to it, I'm glad you're enjoying the ride. I've been talking with Mitch Sturgeon, who's written a very worthwhile book. It's called Enjoying the Ride, 2 Generations of Tragedy and Triumph. The book's available at Amazon.com, and I'll have a link to the book in today's show notes. I'll also include a link to Mitch's award-winning blog, which is also a worthwhile read. Mitch, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, and thank you for everything you do for the MS world, John.
Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, you might want to do that today. You can find Real Talk MS wherever you find the best podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the new Google Podcasts app, and if you have an Amazon Echo or Echo Dot at home, you can just say, Alexa, play the Real Talk MS podcast. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.